Welcome, everyone. This is the Holistic AI Policy Hour. Today, we'll be discussing the NIST AI Risk Management Framework and the Biden-Harris AI Executive Order. It'll be a kind of informative session. I'm Emre Kazim. I'm co-founder of Holistic AI. Holistic AI is on a mission to empower enterprises to adopt and scale AI with confidence. We are a platform provider for AI governance, where companies can manage all their algorithms across the business in a safe and responsible manner. Actually, wanted to emphasize a little bit about our background. We actually spun out of the computer science department of University College London, where we were working on this problem of trustworthiness in algorithms. And at the time when we were doing this, it was a kind of small and peripheral group. And Martin and I were actually joking about this in the kind of preparation session when it was the era when we were writing papers and we were trying to get people to read them. And then all of a sudden it went from a small group of us to global news, day-to-day news. So it's just a fantastic opportunity to be able to do this. It's a real pleasure to have Martin with us. Martin is the chief of the Strategic Technology Branch of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the CISA, who's assigned to NIST. Martin, I was going to actually ask, just before we get going into the kind of details, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about the kind of work that you've been doing, and how it ended up that you are working with NIST?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. It's great to have so many folks from all over the world here today. So I work. My day job is at CISA, where I run the Strategic Technology Program, which is essentially our long-term R&D efforts, requirements generation, as well as running the development of new capabilities to support our operational capacities. And we've been working on artificial intelligence solutions for cybersecurity for quite some time. And so I'm a cybersecurity person. I come from the assessment world and the program world. I ran the cybersecurity program at the Food and Drug Administration for a number of years, and then before that, I was in private industry doing a lot of advanced technology stuff. So it's always been bleeding edge, and I think probably the reason that we ended up getting connected up with NIST, I think to Emre's point, was this was a very small pond up until about a year ago. And there weren't too many people actually working on, I think at one point in time, I might have been the only person in all of DHS that was working on artificial intelligence. I'm joking, but it was a very small group. And we had some good partnerships with NIST. And as NIST was looking to operationalize the AI risk management framework, which I think we're going to talk about in this conversation, these relationships we had been established for quite some time, and there was a conversation before all the ChatGPT stuff and large language model conversations, generative AI, about coming over from CISA, using all of this outreach that we do, all these relationships that we have on the CISA side to help promote the artificial intelligence risk management framework. Because it was released, and it was one of those things where people weren't necessarily really sure if they needed it or why they needed it, and that kind of thing. And of course, kind of coincident to that was this release of ChatGPT, and all of a sudden everyone's concerned with it. And I think we're going to be talking about all the different people, which is really great. I think we talked about all the different areas of expertise that are represented in the audience here. So there's a lot of different folks, from legal, regulatory to technology operations to, mission side, on and on and on and on and on. So I'm happy to talk about all that, and really happy to be here, Emre. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin. Actually a real pleasure to have someone with your authority and seniority discussing this. We know how important this thing is. So just moving to the next slide, I think the way maybe I'll just give a little, just to the audience, to give a heads up that we're going to go through somewhat informative slides, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for question and answer. So as we're going along, please do pop your questions into the chat box. Unless it's prescient, I'll take them at the end, but we'll just probably go through a more informative part, and then we'll go into Q&A. So Martin, at the kind of high level, really just at a high level, what were the strategic intentions behind the NIST AI risk management framework? So what are the kind of high level things that we're looking to achieve through this?
So in the previous administration, there were two executive orders around, preserving leadership and having a strong capacity in this technology area, as well as the use of trustworthy artificial intelligence in the federal government. And those executive orders, which, while not as substantive as the most recent one, which I think we're going to talk about later on in the conversation, laid out two really specific goals for NIST. One was to identify what were the standard needs in these areas, and how could the federal government engage that in a constructive way. And then the second area was this concept of trustworthiness, which is laid out, explicitly in a number of characteristics, which I think we're also going to talk about as well. So the intent of the work around the artificial intelligence risk management framework, was to look at this need for the ability to manage the technology risks of artificial intelligence as it's manifested to people, to organizations, ecosystems, people, and planet. We'll talk, a little bit about that as it differs significantly from what we normally do from a risk management perspective, from a technology side of things, where we're looking specifically at those systems. As I say, as a cybersecurity person, it's the difference between managing risks to systems and data versus managing the risks of harms and benefits to people. So that's probably the first bit. And then the second bit is many of these risk management frameworks that we're familiar with, particularly around security and privacy and the like, are simply focused on negative harms, those kinds of risks, where the AI risk management framework is intended, and as we talk about these trustworthy characteristics and we get it further into the conversation, I want to encourage folks to think about it as it's not only what are the risks, but what are the benefits, because in some instances we're taking on risk because there's a benefit on the other side of it. And so we have to make sure that we're achieving those benefits to make taking those risks worthwhile. So it's a different kind of conversation, and really interesting. As we talk about the way that the AI risk management framework was designed, you have in here voluntary, rights preserving, non-sector specific, use case agnostic, which is exactly the intent. I always say this at the beginning. I'll say this at the beginning, in the middle, at the end, which is neither CISA, my home agency, or NIST are regulators. So none of this is compulsory, but certainly it will assist organizations in any compulsory requirements that they have. There's crosswalks and things like that we can get into and talk about it. But again, this is a voluntary framework, and it's intended to focus on risks to people and the planet.
Just to pick up on the question of it being so, do you see the way in which this worked for cybersecurity? The NIST framework became the de facto standard, notwithstanding it was still voluntary. Do you think something similar is going to take place with the RMF framework, the AI RMF framework?
Well, maybe yes, maybe no. I think for cybersecurity, it was a lot easier to. It certainly could, but for cybersecurity, we had a very fixed, attack surface, which is, these systems and data, and we still have that for AI, and it still applies to the system and data element and one of the things that I like to talk about in these conversations is the cybersecurity discipline, and the cybersecurity practitioners have a lot to provide to support the safe and secure implementation of artificial intelligence to manage these risks. And we can talk about that. But I think specifically, there's a number of regulations that are occurring around the world. I think this is kind of a broader conversation. What's been done, and we can post a link, is there are a number of crosswalks to whether it's the EU AI Act or other kinds of standards efforts that have been done with the ARMF to show how you can leverage the ARMF to meet those objectives. So I think cybersecurity framework is a great way to start the conversation, because the design of the AI risk management framework structurally is very similar with the functions and subfunctions, and the idea that you pick particular functions and sub-functions based on what your concerns and your objectives are. So it's very similar in that way, but being a benefit risk framework and being focused on people makes it different.
I think one other part I was desperate to kind of raise with you, and I think you picked that up straight away, Martin, was this theme of enabling AI adoption or use.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you could just say a little bit about that, because that's something we're finding. It's just there's different ecosystems. Some of them speak quite negatively. It's about the risks and, oh my God, the world's coming to an end, and we need to just like put these layers in. And there's a different approach I've seen in, say, DC and more broadly here, which is about, hey, how do we make sure we harness the potential of these technologies?
So I think this comes through in the most recent, the Biden-Harris, AI executive order. And, I'm old enough, despite my youthful appearance, to remember, us trying to tell people not to use the internet, don't use mobile phones, don't use cloud, don't use tablets, don't use, kind of on and on and on and on and on. And what I like about what's happening with the adoption of artificial intelligence is we seem to have skipped that step. I don't know. Yeah, I have heard some of the conversations, Emre, that you're referencing, but generally, I think folks realize, and I would convey this to all the attendees here today. From CISA's perspective, my day job, we look at technology from three perspectives. How can we use it to advance our mission, right? Which is really important. How do we do more with the taxpayer dollars that we have to, provide better, service to our stakeholders, et cetera. We also look at this technology, from a second perspective, which is how are stakeholders going to use it and increase their attack surface, or change their attack surface, or, how is it going to impact their use of this technology? How is it going to impact our services that we deliver to them? And then lastly, how our adversaries going to use it? And I think you think about this technology, it's massively changing all three of those. So the idea that you cannot get good at this and not use it and not leverage it, really, is probably a false kind of, expectation. That doesn't mean that you jump into it blindly or, unaware of the risks. And that's what we're here to talk about, is how you leverage this approach to make good decisions around grabbing onto those opportunities in a way that you're going to, hopefully regret the least.
Yeah, and just moving on to the next slide, just also what we found is maybe less so from a national, let's say strategic or geostrategic perspective, but even for companies, they have the same problem, which is, look, your competitors are going to be using this thing, and if you don't get a grip of it, you just won't be able to be competitive. So just high level, Martin, for those, so a lot of people have been hearing about this, tracking this. But maybe if you could just walk us through what characterizes a trustworthy AI system for NIST.
So this is one of the, I think there's like 5 graphics in the AI RMF. And so one of the things that you can certainly do is make yourself familiar with it. The document itself, the framework itself, is very approachable. I think it's like 35 pages. It's in plain English. It uses our standard kind of risk language, which, is universal when we think of threats and impacts and likelihoods and, things, along those lines. I mentioned the trustworthy use of artificial intelligence executive order from the previous administration. This is where this concept of trustworthiness comes from, where there was a extensive effort done as part of the development of the ARMF, which was done, in public. There was numbers of, opportunities for comment and public working groups in the standard NIST approach. This was not a knee jerk that happened, in a couple months as a result of the artificial intelligence or the advent of generative AI and concerns that folks had about artificial intelligence, more broadly. The framework was developed, I believe, as starting in almost maybe like 2020, 2021. So it's had a, a long gestation period, and there's been a lot of public comment and collaboration with civil society. So to your question, Emre, this concept of trustworthiness was decomposed into these 7 trustworthy characteristics. They are laid out and defined within the framework. And the intent is to take these 7 trustworthy characteristics as they relate to people. So we're talking about socio-technical systems. We're talking about systems that, we're not looking traditionally as we think about IT systems where we evaluate them in a black box based on, static tests with, fixed measures and that kind of thing. What we're looking at is these trustworthy characteristics as they interact between the technology and the people, and as they are represented from benefits and potential harms. And so, with that said, I mentioned it's only 35 pages, so it is very approachable, even though I said a lot there. These trustworthy characteristics are the sort of the decomposition of the high-level concerns and the high-level opportunities. Now, why isn't it just one size fits all? Why do we look at these context-based? And that's because context matters with the use of this technology. If you take a particular AI technology, let's say image recognition, for example, image recognition has a certain set of trustworthy characteristics that we would be concerned about, and opportunities that we'd be concerned with. Vastly different depending on what that context of use is. And I'll give you 3 examples. So in the context of using image recognition for autonomous vehicles, you can think of all these characteristics: safe, secure and resilient, explainable, interpretable, all through here, valid and reliable. And you can think of, well, there's opportunities here to potentially improve some of these, and there's opportunities here where there might be the potential for harm. We need to think about that. Well, if you change the use case but keep the exact same technology and possibly the exact same algorithm, and you use it to perform facial recognition, the entire construct here changes. And then a third area, and these are just for examples. A third area, if we're using image recognition to do analysis or evaluation of radiological images for a medical purpose. And again, an entirely other set of trustworthy characteristics. So the intent here is to provide a flexible and adaptable approach that works across all these different contexts of use, but takes into account all these opportunities and potentials for harms in a way that fits into your existing enterprise risk management system.
Can we see the next slide, please? I was just going to pick up on that in terms of something I remember having a conversation with your colleagues, some of them actually that same kind of group, and I think they made a great point, which was we're not interested in controlling the technology, we're interested in controlling the harm. So I guess it goes on to another point, and I was going to it's by design, not prescriptive, right? It's just really interesting. So I think this word operationalization, it's funny,
Mm-hmm.
Some of our early work.
I heard people call it O16N, if you want to pronounce it. I was like, wow, that's cool.
It's funny. Some of the first work we did was actually in the context of work that was commissioned by Cisco, and they were interested in this question of operationalizing, let's say, ethics or framework. How does actually one do this in practice? So I would love for you to maybe walk us through this question of operationalizing of the risk management framework, maybe the elements of it, and how do they kind of come together?
So we're still trying to figure it out, and we're still looking for feedback for folks that are early adopters. And I think this is something that, one of the reasons that we're out here talking, that I'm out here, is to promote awareness, and also to sort of open the door for people to reach out to us as they're using the framework and as they're using the tools. And let us know what's working, and let us know where we could make some changes or provide additional materials. I think we're going to talk about some of the stuff that we're doing later on in the conversation. But specifically, if there's one thing that we're trying to accomplish by adopting the AI risk management framework in an organization, it is to create what we describe as a risk-aware culture. So if there's one thing, like the one end game is to create a risk-aware culture, and I describe or define a risk-aware culture as one where we're not trying to, like we do maybe with some risks and some risk management, where we have some folks over in the side of the organization and we have them manage based on some numbers, and they are not necessarily empowered, and they're not part of the organization, generally speaking. And when there's a problem, they end up getting fired, or however that stuff goes. You all know what I'm talking about. The intent here is to build a risk-aware organization where we're concerned about the opportunities, we're asking the right questions. I think in a lot of ways, the way that we've evolved from a cybersecurity perspective, and that's why I think cyber has a lot to offer in the ways that we've integrated into organizations where there's a very good conversation a lot of places about what the opportunities and what the cyber risks are with respect to different kinds of areas of business. And so in a similar fashion, that's what we're trying to accomplish here. And how will I put this in like plain language? We have, well, she's not 3 years old anymore, but I use it anyways. We had a 3-year-old niece who's now 8 years old. But when the 3-year-old niece would come to the house here, everyone hopefully has a 3-year-old niece like we did, who was just lovely and just wonderful. And she'd come to the house, and we don't have any young kids anymore. So there's a lot of expensive stuff lying around, and there's a lot of ways that you could hurt yourself. Well, we would childproof, the room, and of course we're concerned. So we take all the care in the world to make sure that we did it in the right way. But that doesn't mean that we would just leave her alone. Obviously, we're still, aware that there's something we might have missed, or, some way that she could come to harm. And so we're aware. We're aware she's in the house. We're aware that she's running around doing different things, and we're aware, that where she is and what potentially she could get involved in. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about having the people at the table who are going to be able to communicate and articulate what it's going to mean to have people interacting with this technology within a particular mission space. So in that way, it's very different than maybe some cybersecurity stuff. And I always joked, that one of the things that's very different for me working, with artificial intelligence is in the cyber realm, nobody talks to anybody about anything. In the AI realm, everyone talks to everybody about everything. And
Well,
so it's
right.
very different, right?
If they do it right. Yeah, it's. I think something that's just next slide, please, Sidan. I think the thing that's super clear from the NIST approach is that it shouldn't be a tick box exercise.
Correct.
So I think
there are no checklists as part of the framework, just in case anyone was wondering. So one of the things that was mentioned on the previous slide, and we don't have to go back to it, but there is something called the AI RMF Playbook, which specifically is a companion piece to the AI RMF, which provides specific actions that you can take to meet the outcomes that are laid out in the 72 sub-functions. And we're going to talk about, there's 4 main functions: govern, map, measure, manage. And as you can see right here in the middle, this is where we're creating the risk-aware culture. And then map is where we are identifying risks, and we're determining the context of use. So we're identifying how and where we're using artificial intelligence and what are those risks. In the measure function, which is one of the areas that's very challenging right now, because a lot of this measurement science that we're talking about is still basic research. So other methods have to be identified to determine whether or not you're realizing benefits and risks, and how you go about making those determinations. And that's an area also. One of the reasons that I'm out here talking is, we're interested in folks who want to participate in that. That's part of what we're doing in the consortium, which we'll discuss later on. And then last, manage is, of course, what are the actions that you take once you identify that you've realized risks, and how do you go about, doing that in the organization? How do you notify people that, might be impacted, and the like?
Awesome. Next slide, please, Sinan. So look, so one of the big questions. So I absolutely don't expect you to walk through this kind of slide in terms of the, but something that's coming up over and over again, Martin, is, and we get this all the time when we try is saying, okay, so the risk management framework is built in as I said by design, not to be too prescriptive, but actually as a consequence of that, it's flexible enough, or it has the kind of it has the structure to assume different use cases. So could you just walk us a little bit about that? So is it in terms of, so that's it kind of bleeds into the operationalization question, but then also just in terms of how is it the case that that this works across different use cases?
So I think probably the best example I can provide is the one that we already talked about, which was this idea that you can have a singular technology which is used across multiple different contexts, and it's this potentially even the same algorithm, trained on the same data, and it's doing. In one instance, you're using it for autonomous driving. In the second instance, you're using it for facial recognition. And in the third instance, you're using it for, for imagery analysis of, radiological images for medical purposes. And again, these are very, very different contexts, but the same use. And if we really think about that, and we think about, one of the other jokes that I make about cybersecurity is that, one of the things that we always do with cybersecurity, when we determine that there's a way that, using our systems and data can cause some kind of, harm, or there's a threat or some kind of risk, that we've identified, we just tell people not to do it. Make it a policy or something like that, which is something you cannot do with artificial intelligence, because these algorithms are out there and people are going to use them for various purposes. And so what's needed is a approach for them to say, okay, well, we're going to use that same image recognition algorithm. We've made a determination that we can use it for something else. I'm not an expert in that context of use. Emre, you're probably not an expert in that context of use, but they're going to ask us, what do we do? And we're going to tell them, well, the first thing you should do is you should figure out, do you have a risk-aware culture? The second thing is, are you sure you understand the context of use, and specifically, what are the risks of operating in that particular context? Do you have the right people at the table to even answer those questions? Like that's like the first bit of it.
Question for you, just two questions. One is about, and one I was going to ask, you made you kind of emphasized that at the core of this is ensuring that this doesn't impact people in a negative way, and enables companies to be
Well,
able to.
understanding how it could.
Okay, understanding
Right.
how
So it's risk based, right? There's harms and there's harms, right? There's harms where people, could have their safety, back to the trustworthy characteristics, or their rights could be impacted. There's many concerns that people have, and I don't think we're really here to talk about specifically any of that, but for sure we all know what those are. And and then there's other things, the difference between, getting a recommendation that's not something that I want to watch, on my favorite streaming channel, versus, something that potentially impacts, someone's ability to get a loan, or, a job or something like that. Those are entirely two different kinds of, magnitudes of risk. And that's really what we're talking about when we say that the framework is risk-based, because we're not going to manage every risk, down to zero, because that's just not, reasonable.
the question I was going to ask about that is, what about non-consumer facing systems? So does the framework how does the frame? I would assume the framework is just as applicable.
Absolutely. It's just it doesn't have to be consumer. It's about determining, and this is one of the graphics that is in the framework. There's this circle, and within that circle, it lays out who the AI actors are, and they're defined in that way to be the people that, you know, potentially could be impacted. So you could have a, you know, a very narrow use case that impacts, you know, certain, you know, groups and, you know, is operating behind the scenes. But, and, you know, we do this at my home agency, you know, at DHS, and, you know, plenty of other government agencies, as well as, you know, organizations and companies, you know, for example, like, you know, like an employment screening kind of, you know, tool or something like that. You know, that's not necessarily something that requires a tremendous amount of like everyone in the world being, you know, involved in the management of the risk. But certainly the people that are going to be impacted by it, the people that use it, you know, the people that operate it, all should be involved in that process. It shouldn't just be, you know, deployed and then you kind of wait and see what happens.
Awesome. Can you get next slide, please, Sid? Would love to actually talk now a little bit about the actual executive order that came out. I was in DC at the time. Again, it was a kind of funny, like I said, it was that kind of moment where it was like, wow, it became kind of just like every news channel was talking about it, and it was just kind of spread on all of the kind of wires. So would love it if you could kind of walk us through that executive order and how it relates to NIST and the risk management framework. How does that play into the actual executive order itself?
Hang on a second. I'm just answering these questions about the crosswalks, but I will post a link to the crosswalks at an appropriate moment.
Yeah, I'll take that question at the end as well. I'll ask about it. And I saw a bunch of questions about how does it relate to other international frameworks.
Yeah, because we actually there are a number of crosswalks and they're on the NIST website. So this obviously expansive executive order has so many different you know, features to it, and there's probably not enough time to get into, you know, every aspect of it. So I'll talk specifically about the work that NIST and CISA, you know, are involved in. Obviously, CISA, my home agency, is working on how we apply, you know, in our mission space, our capabilities, the national cybersecurity priority around secure by design, you know, how we make sure that technology is deployed in a safe and secure way from a technology perspective, the systems and data approach. The NIST do outs are much more expansive in this executive order. There's actually a website which I'll post this right now in the chat for everyone, which has all the different activities. But in particular, there's a couple things that I've been working on that are you know, fairly substantial. Number one, we're developing a companion resource for the AI risk management framework, which will be a profile of a generative AI risk management profile for the AI risk management framework. And that's something that we've done as part of a open process. We had, in fact, a number of people on this call may have actually participated in this public working group. I was the co-chair on one of the four subgroups, and we'll be releasing this profile, which is focused specifically on, you know, the risks and benefits related to generative AI for obvious, you know, purposes. People are, you know, concerned about that. Another area that I've been working on is the companion resource to the NIST Secure Software Development Framework, and this will be specifically focused on generative AI. We are in the final drafting of the, you know, initial draft. We had a public meeting, a workshop. I think it was back in either late January or early February. It's kind of all running together. But we took all of that feedback from all the participants. This is, you know, industry, academia, civil society, and we put together a draft of the update to this secure software development framework that will account for generative AI. And then obviously, you know, on and on and on and on and on. There's a number of things. A global engagement plan for how we work with the AI standards organizations. And then I think probably the other area that would be really interesting, which I think we're going to talk about, is launching a new initiative to create guidance and benchmarks for evaluating AI capabilities. This is back to that measure function where we don't necessarily have all those capabilities to make those determinations. And what's that going to look like? And that's, I think, where there's going to be opportunities for the public to contribute.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. You have it. Thank you.
No, it was funny.
I should have looked at the slides.
Yeah, we can move on to the next slide actually,
Yeah.
and just talk about that, because we got I think Aiden in the was asking a question about the US AI Safety Institute Consortium. Yep. Happy to say Holistic is part of it, but I know it's part of a broader initiative of where you're engaging with different stakeholders, etc. Could you talk to us a little bit about this and actually
Absolutely.
Pick up on talk to us a little bit about this, and then maybe I'll pick up there's a lot of questions I'll pick up at the end in terms of the comparison with different initiatives and crosswalks.
So the USAI Safety Institute was established at NIST, in the Department of Commerce, at NIST. It was not part of the executive order. This is something that's separate. But the establishment of the AI Safety Institute also closely coincided to the announcement and launch of the AI Safety Institute Consortium. And so this is a formalized mechanism for industry and other partners to work with NIST on the work in the Safety Institute. So there's a credo, which Emre, I'm sure your team ended up, executing, as well as a letter. I think a letter of you had to send in a letter saying how you would participate and all of that. So there was a process, an open process by which organizations were included in the consortium, and then the work of the consortium is going to be focused on developing, as you have here, a number of approaches to complement the work that we're doing in these open research areas. Like, what are best practices? How should those best practices be applied? What the consortium is not, and what we are not doing as part of that work, is the work that NIST is assigned specifically under the EO. That is NIST people doing that work. So it's a separate. This is a separate work area, but this is actually broadening out NIST engagement with the community in these specific areas. In particular, I think there's going to be a lot of work around what does operationalization mean? How do we do TEV, test evaluation, verification, validation of these systems? What does all of that look like? There's so much work to do here, and so much collaboration we can have, and we're looking forward to working with all of you on that.
One thing I certainly picked up, and I thought it was just such it's so striking, is because people come from here in the States, we have our conversations are a lot of people from security, etc., people who have typically kind of that lean into it. And because security or cybersecurity was let's call it a live industry. So you had lots of, you've got incidences, you've got, it's a kind of, one doesn't imagine, so best practice emerges from industry. So it was just very interesting to see, was that the kind of philosophy here, is to say, industry is kind of on the cutting edge. There's a need for knowledge transfer, and is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. There's certainly that. Obviously, the expertise is thin in a lot of these areas, and so we want to make sure that we're able to make the most of the expertise that's out there, and have those new ways in which those participants can participate and can contribute to these important works. I think there's also an opportunity to build out, remembering that this is all context-based, to establish communities and understanding around particular use cases, because I think there's going to be specific ways in which these technologies are used in specific use cases. And, we're going to want to leverage the expertise that folks have that are already fielding these capabilities. We're going to want to, connect people together who, will, provide that full view. Obviously, folks that are generating models may not be operating them, and people that are operating them, may not be aware of all the potential uses of the outputs. And how do we get all those people together to have good conversations about the right ways to use this technology and to maximize the benefits and that's, I mean, for starters, identify what the potential impacts could be, because we don't necessarily even know, in many cases what those are. And, to the extent that we could even just have a list of, potential things that folks should worry about. Those are kind of like the nearer term. But I think, broadly speaking, the idea of having this community is to create a way that everyone can work together to work towards these R&D goals.
Okay. Next slide, please. It's a funny one, actually. This one was just, I think, at the end in terms of talking about very much what we're fighting. So I was going to actually ask you kind of two parts to this, and then the next question. I promise everyone, they've got so many. I'm getting Martin. I don't know how they all end up texting me on my cell as well. I'm getting questions.
Are they really?
Yeah, I'm just like, I'm like,
I haven't had that one yet. I'm doing one of these.
If you're a friend of mine, you don't get priority here.
So I'm looking over at the questions while we're talking.
So it's just really just about kind of, when we approach it as through the platform, there's just like very specific modules and how you do it. You mentioned about inventory and about kind of discovery. I think just moving on to the next slide, I'll talk more broadly actually and start moving to the kind of Q&A. It's just about what does it look, so at the high level, is it about getting a grasp of what's taking place across the business? So there's been a lot of questions. I picked up 2 or 3, which were about, I think specifically about what kinds of things would one have to be reporting or have to be kind of documenting. So that's a more kind of specific question. And then there's a second part, which is, does it just relate to high risk systems? Or is this more kind of, is there something more broad here?
Sure. So I think there's generally these like compliance oriented questions, and I promised at the beginning, in the middle, the end, I was going to say the same thing, which is we're not regulators, and I'm not a regulator in my day job, so we don't view this as a regulation as much as we view it as a way to manage risks, to understand, to bring the organization together to communicate about these benefits and harms, and to do it in conjunction with your existing enterprise risk management approach. And again, this isn't a replacement for cybersecurity or privacy or any of the other kinds of risks that we manage. Whether it's different kinds of human factors, all of those kinds of things, that all still applies. What the ARMF does is it allows you to introduce AI into that conversation in a way that's constructive, and so that's what we're trying to promote here and to get feedback from folks on. And then specifically, we've got these other areas of interest, whether it's specific focuses on generative AI, in those concerns, or whether it's advancing the knowledge and the works around some of these basic gaps that we have. In particular, how do we measure performance of these systems in this socio-technical concept? That is really so important. Like, I've described this to people before as, in a standard kind of cybersecurity, black box testing, we're going to look at the output and that's it. Did it provide what we think the right output is supposed to be? And then yes, and then you check the box and you move on. Well, in a socio-technical evaluation, it's not as simple as that, because you have the output, but then is the output interpreted by whoever's on the receiving end of it, right? Is it interpreted correctly, right? And then are they able to go use it? So it's a much broader kind of understanding and assessment of the performance of the system. And, you know, obviously you can't do that for every single risk, but for like, you know, some kind of high, you know, impact, you know, high potential harm, you know, is this information that I'm getting going to direct me to go off and do something that can cause harm to me or harm to somebody else? Well, you know, you have to take that into consideration.
Martin, so we've got so many questions. I think the one I'm trying to kind of group them into kind of a few themes. I think the first one is, and this is something I'm super interested in, because we've got our experience, but I would love to know, what are you seeing in industry or even in the kind of federal space? What is the maturity level here? Are we still at the, oh God, we need some kind of statement of ethical principles, you know, do no harm and all the rest of it? Or are you starting to see like a real kind of teams forming in industry, or like who were the kind of people that were writing in or representing the industry?
So I mean, I'm pretty constructive on this, and maybe, you know, I'd turn the question back around to you because you have your customers are calling you as well. But you know, from what I understand and from what I'm seeing in you know, federal civilian agencies, which I support, you know, as part of my day job, there's a great effort to engage, to understand what the opportunities are. You know, we discussed earlier on about this, like, you know, head in the sand and like we're just going to tell people not to use it, and you know, we blew through that pretty quickly with an understanding that just wasn't going to be the case. And now, you know, for example, my home agency, DHS, published a privacy impact assessment for the use of approved generative AI in the department. I can put a link in, you know, for that. That's a publicly available document which talks about, you know, the lengths to which, you know, the Department of Homeland Security went to you know, make determinations around how and when this particular technology should be used. And you know, on the back end of that, it involved the entire organization, and we have, you know, very good relationships, despite what, you know, you read in the newspapers, with our you know, with our stakeholders, with, you know, the citizens and people that we interact with. We do have very good you know, relationships with those folks. So you know, I've seen, you know, a tremendous amount of you know, interest and you know, concern about doing the right kind of thing. I think we've got some open areas, you know, in particular, you know, obviously anyone that does any kind of risk management knows that we don't like risks that we know about that we don't have any solution for. You know, I think that's going to be a challenge for adoption or for risk management, because you know, we may know that we have a risk and we may not have the ability to measure it. So we may have some other kind of you know, near-term mechanism in place. So I think if you're looking to do AI risk management as a one-shot deal, you're going to be anxious and you're going to be disappointed. If you're looking at, you know, introducing AI risk management in a risk-aware culture, as you can see in the slide where we had the AI RMF functions, it's a circle. That's because, you know, it's intended to be done, you know, continuously, you know, within the organization. And MAP, like I've had conversations with, you know, particular you know, stakeholders who are looking to just do the MAP function, and they struggle with it. And you know, I always say, you know, MAP's really, really, really hard. Understanding the context of use and what the risks are, you know, associated with that context of use, it's really, really hard if you're only planning on doing it once. You know, if you're planning on doing it as part of something that you're revisiting, you know, as an engagement, you know, with the community, and you're thinking about it in that way, you know, it's not as hard.
Martin, a quick question. This is also about the maturity of not
Sure.
just the industry, but also in the kind of discussions taking place at the federal level. And it's a great question, actually, by Scott about this idea of do you think this will mature into a kind of oversight mechanism and maybe kind of formal audit or audit framework, something along those lines?
So I think that there is going to be, excuse me for a second, I'm just trying to make sure I have my notes here. You know, I think that if we're going to be evaluating anything, it's going to be the organization's capacity to conduct and manage risks, effectively. Because to try to, to try and apply a particular, set of criteria up front and then not think about it anymore, will probably be the most risky way you can think about deploying AI, because of that feature that we talked about earlier, with us not knowing how the components are going to be used, and us not knowing how different populations and different users are impacted, or interpreting or using those outputs in different ways. And so we have to make sure that we understand. I think everyone knows about the shopping cart app, that can make a meal out of bleach and all these other things that can harm you, right? I think you probably all heard about that, right? How would you know that that was the case? At face value, it sounds like a really cool thing to go do, to take all your contents of your shopping cart and create a meal for yourself. That sounds like maybe a fun thing to do, right? Until you realize that you had bleach or something else in your cart that would kill you, right?
Martin, something that so I think that's exactly I think is probably the way it's. This is just speculative, but probably a codification of best practice will take place much later on. As in we're nowhere near there right at the moment. Question for you now on the kind of comparison questions. I don't want to get into. I know people asking very specific ones about.
Well, actually, if you don't mind, let me answer Scott's question, because he seems like he asked it twice about basically around oversight and compliance and all that. So Scott, there is and there was a draft OMB memo, which is focused on federal agency use of artificial intelligence, and that there was a lot of specifics within that draft memo. My understanding is the intent is for that memo to be released at some point. And so if you're interested in, what you think, or what the thinking is, or, what we're going to see in the near term around, oversight, at least at the federal level on, federal agencies, you can find that there. And then I think some of this other stuff around, specific audits or specific oversight of this technology within particular areas, that's also part of the AI executive order, but not in my lane. It's direction that's to specific federal agencies that regulate, to make determinations about how and in what way this technology should be understood and regulated in the spaces that they regulate. But again, I'm not a regulator in either one of the agencies that I work with right now.
So I think that goes again. I think that's why maybe I didn't want to go into the weeds of specific kind of ISO standards or the EU AI Act and so on and so forth. But Martin, more from a kind of philosophical perspective, what is? I think you mentioned it before, Missy. We're building it. We're conscious that there are these kind of side. Well, the EU AI Act was a seismic event, notwithstanding that it's regulatory and not very much not voluntary. But could you talk just in this sense of how does this fit into the broader ecosystem of on the one hand, the standards and more on, if you will, global regulatory ecosystem? We do a lot of work with the OECD, for example, and sometimes the OECD is on a bridge. But could you talk a little bit about that?
So all those crosswalks, Namisha, thank you for putting the link in the chat here about all the crosswalks, because there are a number of crosswalks, and if you have any others that you'd like us to post up there, we're happy to take those under consideration and review them too. Because in many ways, like a lot of different kinds of regulatory frameworks that are developed in different places, at the end of the day, it's a lot of the same ideas with different terms, or just organized in different ways, around different priorities. And that's not to say that that's bad. It's just the way that those communities operate. And so I think, for starters, it's really important to understand the community that you're operating in, and what those contexts of use are, and how it can impact those communities. I think, I don't, philosophically is probably a bad way to think about it.
Apologies for the phrase.
Because I don't get paid to be a philosopher, as much as I like to think about things. But I think probably the best way to answer that question is, we're really focused on getting feedback on how things are going so far using the framework. We're really trying to understand how people are looking at measure, and where they're developing new approaches to measuring the impacts of these systems, both for good and for bad, and how that implementation in the enterprise risk management approach, in whatever in various organizations, is going to create this risk aware culture. We're very interested, I think, in getting feedback on those things, as well as having people participate as they see and as they would like in our in all these ways that we made available to folks. I mean, there's never been more RFIs and different kinds of comment periods, and every single thing that NIST produces, there's a comment period. I've never seen an OMB memo that was open for public comment for 2 months. Like, I've never really seen this kind of stuff happen, and it's good, and there's an opportunity for folks to contribute.
I mean, it's funny, just in closing, I just saw one of the participants, a friend of ours from UNESCO, leading the UNESCO work on AI, and it's just incredible just how these kind of large bodies are working together. So let me just close by saying a massive thank you, Martin. This has been like super informative, and more broadly, it's just incredible how much engagement and how open your community is, and the folk at the NIST community. So just to say thanks to everyone. Our next webinar will be in March. We're pleased to say that we'll be having Kai Jenner, who is a member of the European Parliament, and he'll be talking about the AI Act. So all of your questions on the AI side will be dealt with there. But just to say a massive thank you. I think in the follow-up, I think Martin will be able to follow up everyone with maybe some links and questions as well.
I put my email address in the chat, so
awesome.
Bring it on. We're happy to come out and do individual engagements with organizations if that's helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you at the next policy hour. Thank you again. Really, thank you, Martin. Take care.
Thank you as well. Thanks, everybody.